Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello once again, and welcome to my little world of scandal. Thank you for joining me here at the Australian bar. I think I'll stay here. I sort of move around the house, but this is probably... I think this is me, really. This Australian art. Odd bottle on the bar. It's Campari this week. That's my mother-in-law's favourite drink. My producer says I should share more details about my life. Well, my mother-in-law, Jennifer, who's amazing, she lives around the corner and has for a long time. So she was a big part of our kids, her grandkids' childhood. That was lovely. And we see her a lot, and we go on holiday with her. She's 86. Sorry, Jennifer. I shouldn't, should I? But I don't think she's listening at the moment. She's 86. We see her a lot. Campari and tonic is her drink of choice at the Australian bar. I prefer Campari and soda, but it takes all sorts. Anyway, so yes, my life. I'll share a bit more about my life if you like. I shared the cover of my book on Twitter for the first time. The book I will be talking about a lot more as we get closer to publication in April next year, 1945. The Reckoning, Phil Craig, Hodder and Staunton, to be published in the UK and I think in India and Australia and New Zealand. So if you follow me on Twitter or you want to, I can't bear calling it X, but I suppose I have to really. It's kind of creeping in, isn't it? Anyway, if you follow me on X or Twitter, I put a picture up of the cover. And it's a good response already. Actually, I'm also doing the notes, which is an enormous struggle because I used to work with Tim Clayton as a dear friend, and we wrote several books together. And Tim's a proper academic, and he knows how to do things in a correct scholarly way. So he was really on top of the notes and footnotes and kept track on it all. And I started with the best of intentions. In the later chapters, things got a bit awry. And the result is this. I'll just turn around and give you an insight into the scandalous state of... Here we are, great piles of books, research. Oh dear, we make you seasick. So much of it here. Can't really get it on the camera. Hang on. And knock over. Cup. Yeah, this is various books. I'm trying to find my source references, bits of scribbled notes from the National Archives in Kew. Oh, it's a mess. And it's always the one under the bed that's got the notes you really want, or the one that you sent back to the library. However, another insight into my life, Mrs. Craig is the manager of a library in southwest London. Well, actually, Battersea now. She was a Putney for a long time. So I do get first dibs on the library books. So I'll have to get a few back to finish the notes. All right, that's enough about the book. Svarti Singh, I hope you're listening or watching Svarti. Should it be, even as we speak, getting her mug, the comment of the month, in beautiful Croydon, South London. And it's the very first mug from the Scandal Mongers shop that's just got me on it. See, this is the one that people had so far, Andrew and Phil, and you can still get them. Let's not forget Andrew, lovely Andrew, and he will be back, and he is still my mate, whatever people say in the comments. We didn't fall out at all. In fact, I'm hoping he's going to give me an endorsement for my book. So you can get a mug with just me if you're interested, and you should, because Christmas is coming, and I can't imagine a better gift for your mulled wine or your hot cocoa as you sit by a roaring fire or whatever people do in the Southern Hemisphere this time of the year. Went on Shauna, Vintage Read. That was fun. I think it's my third visit on the Vintage Read podcast, which if you've not seen, you should. She's great company. And she has an interesting mix of modern comment on scandals, often, but also royal matters and book reviews and authors. And it was really good to talk to her. We talked about Fired, and I dug into my files from my Diana book and my Diana TV project and found some really cool things that I shared with her. For example, things I hadn't bothered to put in the books that wasn't really my focus, about Martin Bashir, suggestions that he was perhaps involved more in Diana's life after the famous interview and may have been somehow connected to her relationship with Fired. Also, the suggestion from people at the time, friends of Diana's, that they were worried when she first got into Fired's orbit that his interest in her was not for his son, but for himself, that he had a sort of Jackie Onassis fantasy playing in his mind. I'm not sure Diana would ever have gone for it, but that was an interesting insight, especially now we know more about Fired. Oh, and also that he was going to found this global charity. I mean, it sounds gross, doesn't it? Now that he's being exposed as, well, allegedly, but there's so much evidence coming forward every day now as a kind of Weinstein level abuser, a manipulator, predator, that he was going to form a charity for good works, the Princess of Wales humanitarian mission to whatever. Oh my goodness. And next week, David Hooper is coming back on the podcast. He was on about a couple of months ago. I think it was the last one I did with Andrew. Now, David is a really interesting man. He was the lawyer who worked with Vanity Fair in the 90s, around the time that Diana got involved with Fired, defending this article. It was the first time anybody really had aired some of these allegations about Fired. And he came on the podcast, came on, well, on Zoom with me, and I'll put it up next week. Incredible interview. You really want to watch this one. Full of things I've not seen in the papers about what it was like to take on the Fired machine and the police and the suggestions of corruption in the police and the private detectives and the alleged phone tapping and videoing and the pressure put on him by various of Fired's goons. I think that's a fair word to use. I say, fair warning, the story does include the word bung rather a lot, which David explains in his posh British barrister voice means bribe, and 2 incidences of nudity. So there you are. Hopefully I'll still keep my 15 rating or 12 rating, whatever I have. But no, it's an incredible interview and you really want to watch it. All right. Yes, and after the interview I did with Shauna, there were so many comments on her page, on the bio of the program I was on with her. And a lot of them were women who were talking about the 70s and 80s and the things that they put up with. And some of those stories are pretty horrible. And I talked last week about the kind of culture of permissiveness and how that sometimes merged into a sort of an instinct to forgive people for going way, way, way too far into totally illegal acts. And it looks like there was lots more of that, and not just with Fire, just in life generally. Some lovely comments as well on that particular episode with Shauna. Patty FM, Philly, guessing maybe from Philadelphia. Thanks, Shauna. Your chats with Phil are always A+. There you are, Shauna. Hope you're watching. Please have me back. My own little interview with Simon Heather did rather well. Terrific response. I think it's got about 5,000 downloads already, which for me, as a solo podcaster, is not bad. And it's only been 3 days since it went down. 3 or 4 days from when it went out to when I'm recording this. Spoke Insight. I'm not sure I've come across you before. Thank you for watching. Fascinating, he or she says. And it goes to show that royal scandals have a very long history. He's talking about the abdication crisis. I love your show. Oh, I do like that kind of thing. Catherine Anderson, 3348. She asked the killer question, where is Andrew? I really enjoy your podcast, but where is Andrew? I enjoy him too. So I replied, Andrew has promised to come back now and again, but he's too busy and too damn successful to do this every week. Me, however, ... Well, I'm quite busy, but I'd also quite enjoy it. And Catherine came straight back. Oh, thanks so much for your reply, Phil. I live in Helena, Montana, in the States, and I love history of all types. You've got interesting guests, and you ask great questions. Thanks again. Well, that's nice. Thank you. Sending all best wishes to Helena, Montana, one of the few states in America I have never visited, and I would like to. Taylorgate. Talked about freebiegate last week and how that was shaking British politics and whether it really was important or not. And this week, everybody here is talking about this Taylor Swift story. And people are guess what? People are getting angry on the internet about it. Some people think it's a major scandal. Some people say, no, this is just nonsense. This is so trivial. Okay, here are the facts. Ahead of her first concert in the summer, the police discussed giving her special protection, what's called a blue light escort. Now, they did this for good reason. She'd had a credible death threat or a threat to her concert in, I think it was Vienna, only a few weeks before. And we know pop concerts have been attacked by terrorists before, famously horribly in Manchester and also in Paris. Also, Taylor Swift herself is a sort of political figure. She speaks out about things. She's come out recently, heavily in favor of the Democrats at the election and spoken on various issues. So there was, no doubt a credible threat. However, the police decided that no, we're not giving you this treatment. This is for foreign dignitaries, politicians, not pop stars. Anyway, it looks like number 10, the government machine got involved and this decision was reversed. Maybe that's what governments are there to do. Concert happens, the first concert. Keir Starmer, various family members, various members of the cabinet, friends, hangers-on, all get free tickets. VIP, all lovely, everything comped. Well, looks a bit, I don't know, they're not poor people. Can't they pay for their own tickets? Anyway, 3 or 4 days later, she did like 5 concerts. It was record breaking, 5 or 6 at Wembley Stadium. I mean, it was an amazing week. The Starmers go again. More freebies. I mean, we're talking thousands of pounds worth of freebies. And Starmer gets to meet her backstage. And this becomes part of the row about Freebiegate. I mean, the money is small compared to some of the other freebies that came out. Suits, things like that. Staying in people's billionaire apartments, etc. Anyway, Starmer repaid the money. And I think grudgingly, so did some of his ministers. They repaid the money that they'd got, the free tickets. They paid them back after this backlash. And that was a couple of weeks ago. But there's more coming out. Sue Gray, very powerful kind of functionary, effectively chief of staff for the new government. She's been fired. Talks of all sorts of, backstage intrigue and vendettas. It's a bit like Boris Johnson again, guys. But her son, Liam Conlon, is a Labour MP. That's handy, isn't it? And it turns out that he got, was it £1,800? $3,000 worth of freebies from the Taylor Swift visit. That's a lot of money, isn't it, for somebody who's got quite a bit? And that's for the son of the woman who probably sat down and arranged the police escort. And yeah, look, it's not Watergate. It's not like those French presidential scandals where there's hundreds of millions in a Swiss bank account. It's small stuff. And a lot of people, especially on the left, are saying, what's the big deal? But imagine how it would have played out the other way. Let's go back to the age of Boris Johnson or even Rishi Sunak. A right-wing celebrity, let's say Elon Musk is coming to London. Here's a public figure. He speaks out about things. Perhaps it turns out he's got threats to his life. I bet he has. And the same story plays out. The police say no, the government says yes. Then it turns out the government have all been kind of entertained by him, backstage stuff, lovely dinners, lovely meals. I think that would have been quite a big deal had it been Boris Johnson, because it would have sat with all the other examples of rule breaking and sleaze and favours that brought him down, really. And it sort of sits badly with the ordinary public. We're facing cuts to various programmes here. Pensioners are having their winter fuel allowance cut back. That's going to materially affect the lives of people, and they see those in power yucking it up with celebrities, taking freebies, people who are already well off. It doesn't sit well. And it reignites the whole sense of cronyism. 200 civil servants, apparently, appointed without the regular checks, but all Labour Party apparatchiks. Well, you might argue that it's good for a political party to put its own people in place if it wants to get things done. But, it's not usual, and it looks bad. It looks like, one lot's got its snouts out of the trough and the other lot's leaping back in there, snout first. And I tend to be pro-government. I think, I stuck with Tony Blair for a long time. I was more sympathetic to the Tories than most people. I think the government's struggling with real-world problems often don't get much slack cut. And it's easier to oppose, to take cheap shots, to have a laugh, use the memes. I mentioned last week, I think this is partly why Rishi Sunak threw in the towel. He's having a lot of fun now, teasing Starmer with various bad puns about Taylor Swift songs. So I am sympathetic to the government. I wish them well. It's early days. They've got a big majority, but they were elected with actually quite a small number of votes compared to previous governments. Their victory was really a factor of the British right kind of splitting, and a lot of Conservatives were sort of fed up at their own party. Some of them just didn't vote. Some of them went off with this other party further to the right called the Reform Party. So Labour came right through, won lots of seats. It'll probably never win again. So it's got a big majority. It's got a lot of goodwill. I wish it well. And it's early days, but it's not been a great start. And I think the word scandal could and should be applied. Anyway, I'm not the sort of person who'll make cheap Taylor Swift remarks. So this London boy is going to turn to the blank space for the rest of the podcast and shake off all of this stuff and get to something a bit more serious, which of course is the Kennedy family. Maureen Callahan, incredible book. I don't think I need to give this one much of an introduction. So much has been written and said about the Kennedys. They've always been the focus. They've always had star power, haven't they? And of course, all that tragedy, lots of deaths, especially the two most shocking political assassinations, two of the most shocking political assassinations we've ever seen. So a lot of sympathy and a lot of glamour. Um, but there's always been stories about the way that they treated women, not only the women that they married or had affairs with or dalliances with, if that's the right word, women in their own family too. And Maureen has put together a very, very comprehensive account, and she's very passionate about it. So I think I should let her take over, and I will see you at the end of that. Thanks for listening. Bye. Maureen, thank you so much for joining me. What a book. I'm in shock. I mean, I read books all the time that have got sort of stunningly shocking stories, but I'm not sure I've ever read one that's got such a sort of relentless number of more and more and more.
I guess I'll take that as a compliment. I mean, first of all, Phil, thank you for having me on your podcast. Yes, that was actually very much a concern while writing the book. You know, I didn't want the reader to feel exhausted by the midway point, going, what fresh hell awaits me on the following page. And so it was very important to me to really, and I didn't have to look very hard with some of these women, many of them, in fact, to lean into what made them so exceptional and what made them these sort of lodestars for these Kennedy men who needed an equal amount of star power on their arms in order to ascend to the heights they were seeking to reach.
No, I think just as a literary critic, I think you do an amazing job getting into the skin of these women. You really bring them to life. You see them as independent people with their hopes and dreams and talents, and you really catch their point of view, and which I think is something obviously you really wanted to do to give them their due, because otherwise they're just people who have been used and abused all too often.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And in fact, the more I got into researching, and I had read quite a lot about the Kennedys prior to even doing this book. This family has long held a fascination for me. But what became very clear was that the things that attracted these men, what attracted JFK to Jackie Bouvier, what attracted, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to Mary Richardson, or JFK Jr. to Carolyn Bessette, was they burned bright. These women were beautiful. They were unique. They had original minds. They had charisma. But it turns out those very same qualities would only eventually come to evoke seething resentments in their husbands. And then begins the slow process of annealing them, of stripping them of their power. And it begins slowly, but it accrues to the point where, as we're seeing in America now, there's another RFK Jr. sex scandal exploding, if you can believe it. I can. But sort of tactic number one out of the Kennedy male playbook when dealing with an inconvenient woman is to call her crazy.
But it seems amazing to me how not just political allies, but the press, elite opinion, whatever you want to call it, just goes along with this. That shocking headline, was it about Teddy's blonde? When, this
Ted's
remarkable
blonde.
woman.
Yeah.
And she's just referred to as Teddy's blonde. We'll get onto that story in more detail, I hope, later. But, I had no idea, and I'm ashamed to say that this was a talented, gifted activist, not some kind of party girl. But frankly, had she just been a party girl, it wouldn't have mattered. She was still treated foully. But no, that's what I say. You really bring them to life, and I think it's amazing. Did you think the book was... Obviously, you felt it was necessary, but even now it seems to me that there's still a lot of power in the legend, and a lot of kind of people just want to forgive this family. They just want to. I don't know why. You must have a theory about that.
I thought about that a lot. Why there was this desire to forgive over and over. And we're not just talking mishaps. Like, we're seeing in America now with Kamala Harris's husband. Like, oops, I somehow fell on the nanny and got her pregnant. It's not that. It's like I left a woman to die in 3 feet of water who struggled to breathe through a tiny air pocket and lived for hours and could have been saved had he stopped along the way at any of the lit houses or the payphones on his route or past the firehouse he ran right by. And I think it's manifold. I think the basic reason is that America saw JFK assassinated, and it runs on a loop every November in America. We see this. And even if you weren't alive at the time, you have grown up seeing it. And it is a national trauma. We're watching the murder of an American president, a young, vital American president. Jackie bears some blame here because after the assassination, she rushed to create this Camelot myth. She enshrined it this way. She strong-armed Life magazine 1 week after the assassination into writing her version of events. And it wasn't just to memorialize her husband's presidency as more than it was, because she knew he was in danger of becoming a historical footnote. But it was also to, I believe, enshrine their marriage as real, because the entire White House press corps knew what was going on. They knew that JFK was shuttling women all over the country. One, a very young teenage White House intern, who is also in the book. They knew all about Marilyn Monroe, that he and both his brother Bobby were having sexual relationships with her at the same time. They knew about all of this, and Jackie knew that they knew. And so she creates this bedrock myth that everybody wants to believe. And so by the time Ted Kennedy leaves Mary Jo Kopechne to drown in the aforementioned 3 feet of water, not only has Jack been assassinated, but Bobby's been assassinated, also captured on live television, another trauma. And so what much of the American public wants to do is find a reason to forgive. So this tragedy in the hands of very skilled political machinists becomes not Mary Jo Kopechne's loss of life at 29, but Ted's tragedy.
So interesting. So interesting. Well, I want to just jump back because the stuff you have on Joe Kennedy is so interesting. I actually met and interviewed one of his London secretaries, a woman called Paige Wilson, about 20 years ago in Georgetown. And she, you won't be surprised to hear, didn't think much of him, not only for his open admiration for Hitler, but, his wandering hands, his general kind of lechery. I think the word she used was not safe in taxis, dear boy, not safe in a taxi.
Yeah.
But of course, you have him much worse than that. You have him as a rapist, effectively.
Oh, yes. I mean, so I sort of talk in the intro briefly about the fundamental beginnings of why the Kennedy family treats women, just sort of like puts them through this meat grinder and expels them. And I think that Joe's biblical original sins were twofold. The political, of course, the admiration for Hitler, the bloodless acceptance of the looming death of Western democracy, the personal being the forced lobotomization of his beautiful, vibrant daughter, Rosemary, the beauty of the family at 23 years old. And I really wanted to dig into this because when it was finally revealed that a Rosemary even existed, I mean, in America, it was in the 1980s after he died, long after he died. And even her siblings didn't know where she was. She just vanished, never spoken of again.
Talk about being shocked. There is a passage in your book that I can't shake from my mind. And I'd never read the detail of what happened to her before. And you should tell it because you tell it so very well. But asking her questions as they are basically mutilating her brain so they can judge just how much I feel weird just talking about it. But I'd love you to explain for the viewers just what happened to her and why.
Yes. So Joe secretly takes Rosemary to a hospital in Washington, D.C. And we don't know how he got her there, what he told her they were going to do. She is laid out on an operating table with a sandbag placed under her head. And she is told that they're going to shave half of her hair off, her beautiful hair. And she doesn't understand why. And they say, we're going to do this operation and you're not going to feel a thing. In fact, you won't even need anesthesia. This is how simple this is going to be. And they drill a hole in her head and they take what is essentially a butter knife and they begin slicing inside her frontal lobe. And they have her repeating things such as the Lord's Prayer, the Pledge of Allegiance. Can you count to 10? Can you sing a nursery rhyme? And only when she becomes nonverbal do they stop.
Oh my God.
And she is left with the physical and mental capacities of a 2-year-old forever. So she can never speak. She cannot walk on her own. She can't toilet herself. She, I believe, suffered a fate worse than death. Why? Why? Now, the Kennedy line, ever since the press discovered the existence of this woman, has been Rosemary suffered from mental deficiencies that were so alarming to her parents that they overcorrected. And this tragedy ensued. This was never meant to be a lobotomy. And that is a lie. It was meant to be a lobotomy, and it was meant to shut Rosemary up because her father had left her in England in the run-up to Hitler bombing England while he got all the other Kennedy kids out of there. He knew that Hitler was going to exterminate the mentally impaired. And when he did go back to London and to rural England for his job as ambassador, he used Rosemary as his quote unquote companion. And I learned that friends of the family who had been close enough to observe Joe with Rosemary found something sinister and incestuous in his dealings with his daughter. And so he had to shut her up because the older she was getting, the more this stuff was coming to the surface, her trauma. And Phil, I will tell you, since the book has been published, I heard from someone very close to the family that that is in fact true. And it is something that they discuss to this day.
Wow. God. That is, I mean, it is a devastating story. You tell it so brilliantly and,
Thank you.
with this discretion, but also frankness. And it was a standout part of the book for me. But I mean, your description of Joe overall as the kind of the creator of the original sin, the sort of sexual competitiveness that he clearly passes on to his children, this idea of sex, and you describe lots of sex acts in your book, as almost perfunctory, not about connecting people, not even about pleasure, but just about sort of like working your way down a list or something. And that seems to have been his attitude to relations with the opposite sex.
Yes, he had real contempt for his wife, for Rose. He flaunted his mistresses in front of the children. To your earlier point about Joe actually being a rapist, a young JFK, a teenage JFK or early 20s, would warn friends of his sisters who would come to the house for overnight visits to lock their doors. His sort of way of describing it was he would say to them, the ambassador has a tendency to wander at night, meaning to wander right into these girls' rooms and rape them. And it was just sort of the cost of doing business if you wanted to be close to this family. JFK seemed to inherit this, which was every woman who ever had a sexual encounter with him said it lasted no more than 3 minutes. There was no kissing. There was no foreplay. There was no joy. There was no intimacy. There was nothing. It was just like scratching an itch that was never, ever calmed down. And even Jackie, once married to him, as famous as she was at that time, confided in her doctor and her priest and said, how do I make this part of our marriage better? Because he just goes too fast and falls asleep. And she thought it was her. And I'm sure she was encouraged to believe it was her.
Well, I mean, I do love the story of Mimi Beardsley, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly.
Yes, that's right.
She's one of the standout characters, I think, in the book. Again, somebody I'd never heard of till I read it. I mean, I knew that he had sort of, he's tried to have his way with all the interns and, the young women at the White House, but it was much more than that with her. Do you just, I'd love to hear you give me a few minutes on her story, really, because it's sort of emblematic, I think, of how he treated lots of women.
Mimi's story is so important, and I'll briefly sketch it out for you, and then I'll tell you why it remains so. So she began working at the White House as a 19-year-old virgin, excited to work there, as so many were, compelled by Kennedy's youth and modernism and futurism. First day, JFK's top aide comes over and says, "Why don't you come up to the residence at the end of the business day and have a drink?" And she's just bowled over. So, of course, she goes up. And suddenly the president materializes in the White House residence. "Mimi, would you like a tour?" Gives her a tour. Jackie's away. Next thing you know, she's had like several margaritas, or no, what's his drink? His drink was, it'll come to me. Daiquiri. Daiquiri was his drink. Several daiquiris. She's drunk. He throws her on Jackie's bed. Within 3 minutes, she's been deflowered. He says to her, "Have you done this before?" She says, "No, a boy has kissed her once." She later writes that she doesn't know what to call this encounter, but short of screaming, there was nothing she could have done to get him off of her.
So
The
this is
following Monday.
This is not even Monica Lewinsky level of expertise,
No,
is it?
it's
This
worse.
is a very young person, the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, in the middle of the Cold War, in his own wife's bedroom.
I consider what happened to Mimi, she wouldn't, but I do, statutory rape. I absolutely do. 3 days later, she's invited to the swimming pool, the White House swimming pool. Same aide is sitting on the lip of the pool. JFK says, "Mimi, Dave looks a little tense. Why don't you go over and relax him?" So she goes over, feels she has no choice but to perform oral sex on this man while JFK silently watches. This is the dynamic. So flash forward to the aughts, 40, 50 years after JFK has died. Mimi writes her memoir, which is all but ignored by the mainstream media until the New York Post picks it up and splashes it on the front page, and suddenly it's a story. And the media has no choice but to pay attention to this. But as Mimi is invited on many, many shows to discuss this, she is pilloried as the perp here. She is the one who is desecrating the sainted image of an American president. How dare she? Phil, if this had happened post Me Too, while the sentiment in many American newsrooms may have been the same, there is no way anyone would have gotten away with painting Mimi as the perpetrator and JFK as the victim.
Absolutely. I mean, but you have many Mimis. I mean, do you ever put a number on it? I can't remember the number of liaisons of this kind that he had while president.
There's no way to know, but, Cy Hirsch, a legendary American reporter, wrote a book that was published in, I want to say, 97 or 98. It was called The Dark Side of Camelot. This is the first time he blew open what really went on. And he quotes JFK's Secret Service agents as being disgusted by him, that every time they traveled, their jobs included procuring hookers, sex workers, what have you, and guarding hotel rooms while JFK hosted orgies and shuttled his multiple drugs around the country to keep him going. This was not what they signed up for. This is not in the job description. Their job is to take a bullet. Their job is not to procure sex workers for a president who was more concerned with partying than doing the job.
Amazing, amazing. There's so much I want to talk about. I want to move to Marilyn because everybody loves the story, and you have some really interesting, I think, new insights into the Marilyn Monroe tragedy. And there's been a lot of recent coverage. I suspect some of it is connected to your book, but I think there's no doubt now that, as you said earlier, that both of them were not only having affairs with her, but they were talking to her like a lot, like on the phone in the last few weeks of her life. Do you have your own?
Yeah.
Do you have your own theory about whether or not that kind of triangle was a factor in her death, or will we never?
Absolutely. It's absolutely a factor in her death. Now, her own psychiatrist, took copious notes, which he released after her death. And he was extremely alarmed by her involvement with the Kennedy brothers. For Marilyn, who had been a product of the foster system and molested and raped by stepfathers, other men, she found a kind of validation in their attentions. She wanted only, above all else, to be considered intelligent. And this gave her that sense. But she was becoming a problem for them because as JFK was discarding her quite callously, and Bobby was brought in to crisis manage, but he was discarding her quite callously. He was then the sitting U.S. Attorney General. Both Kennedy brothers under investigation by the CIA and the FBI. Marilyn threatened to go public. She said, if you're going to dispose of me, I'm going to call a press conference and tell the world exactly who you two are. So she had to be, much as Rosemary Kennedy was, shut up. The day of her death, what emerged on these wiretaps that the FBI and the CIA had secretly installed inside her house at 5th Helena Drive in LA was Bobby Kennedy showing up to her house, demanding to know where something was. He said, where is it? Where is it? Where the F is it? We need it. There was the sound of something or someone hitting a wall or the floor. Hours later, she's dead. Her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, himself a legendary American ball player.
This is America's, the man who represents justice
America's
for a country of 300 million
head of the
people.
DOJ. Exactly.
Terrible.
And this actually goes to show the power that Marilyn Monroe had, how afraid of her they were. Now, they would posit that she was crazy and a drug addict and out of her mind and a stalker. In fact, they were gaslighting her the entire time. After she died, her ex-husband, Joe DiMaggio, banned the Kennedy family from her funeral and said, and I quote, I always knew who killed Marilyn, but I didn't want to start a revolution in this country.
Extraordinary. That is, yeah. Oh, and the other, I mean, there are so many. I just say, we only have a limited amount of time, but there were details of Chappaquiddick, which I'm ashamed to say I never knew till I read the book. Especially that he was so unfit to drive that night. It wasn't that he simply just abandoned this poor woman to her fate. He should never have been in the car in the first place. That's right, isn't it?
That's right. And Phil, when you say, you're ashamed, you don't know this detail or that detail, you absolutely shouldn't be. A lot of people don't know, and that's why the book is so relevant, especially now. It's not like this stuff is taught as part of the curriculum of American history. Chappaquiddick is never taught in American schools. I can guarantee you, I can promise you. Ted Kennedy, who was known as a profoundly unserious, alcoholic, womanizing, sexual abuser, drove this poor girl off a bridge in the dead of night. And for anyone who is unfamiliar with the terrain of Chappaquiddick, it is wild. It is dark. There are no street lamps. These are dirt roads. You have to know exactly where you're going. The bridge itself is very small. Back then, there were no guardrails. He was driving so fast that he flipped the car upside down. He managed to get out. She did not. And what he did was run back to his inn. This is the part where I think the lack of conscience is indisputable. Goes back to the hotel, goes back to his room. People are partying next door, calls down to the front desk, says, can you please make them be quiet? It's interrupting my ability to sleep. The next morning,
Has he not told anybody about the accident yet?
He's told two of his fixers who have run back. Now, if any of your listeners have seen the episode of Succession where Kendall goes over a cliff with the waiter, that's their version of Chappaquiddick.
Got it.
The fixers are called. They come in. They can't save this person either. And now it becomes a crisis to manage. And part of managing that crisis is disparaging the victim. So what detail do the Kennedy family make sure gets out about Mary Jo? She wasn't wearing underwear that night. Why? Guess what the medical examiner showed? She was a virgin when she died. She was 29. Her whole life ahead of her, a political star, dead, disparaged, forgotten.
Yes, well, I do love the way you humanize her because I didn't know of her talents and that she was a rising star in the party. And she had so much to live for and should have lived to experience. And it was taken away from her by that terrible man, that terrible night. As you say, there were so many opportunities. She probably lived for what, half an hour? We don't know.
Hours. The
Hours.
diver who recovered her body later testified at the inquest that she survived hours and that if they had just gotten help, she would have lived. She didn't drown. She suffocated.
And as we said earlier, I've just found the actual headline from one of the American tabloids. Teddy escapes, blonde drowns.
And I reprinted that front page in the book. The book is the art in the book is a combination of images of these women at crucial moments and also reproductions of the American media's coverage of these events. Blonde drowns makes Mary Jo a footnote, sort of an irrelevancy in her own death, her own wholly preventable death. There's another version, exactly the same. One of RFK's sons, Joe III, recklessly flipped a Jeep on Nantucket, paralyzed an 18-year-old girl for life. The New York Times coverage of this called it Joe's mishap.
It's, without it being, one can get party political because, of course, when Clinton was president, he was forgiven for so much. And again, the women involved were always blamed, dismissed as bimbos and airheads and so on. And that's not so long ago. Do you think if it happened now with a new Democratic president, there would be any difference? Have we moved on a little bit, do you think, from that time?
No. And I'll tell you why. And again, I think that's why this book is so important, because I hope what it will also do for readers is have them train their eye a bit more cynically at who's telling the story and the version of events they're choosing to believe. You mentioned Bill Clinton, perfect example, ripped right out of Ted Kennedy's playbook, which is what kept him in the Senate until his death. Maybe problematic in his personal life for women, but boy, is he great at legislating for you. You want Roe to survive? Vote for Ted.
You are back. Oh, are you?
Yes. Okay. Yes, I'm back.
Sorry, just to pick up. Yes,
Sorry.
Because they delivered for the party and for the voters, they could kind of do what they wanted, is your theory.
So we're seeing this now twofold with two Democratic male stars. RFK Jr. is currently in the midst of a sex scandal. A young, glamorous reporter for New York Magazine, it has emerged, had a sexual relationship with him. We're hearing it's only over the internet. We'll see. He began tarring her in the press as crazy, aggressive, a stalker, chasing him with porn. It has since emerged that there are at least 3 other women he's been having affairs with for the past year. Nobody's really paying attention. Secondly, Kamala Harris's husband, this has just broken in the US. Aside from impregnating the nanny during his first marriage, paying her $80,000 to go away, a new allegation that she believes he caused her miscarriage of said child. The story is also just broken that he slapped a former girlfriend in the face outside an A-list gala at Cannes so hard she spun around. We broke this story at the Daily Mail. I just columned on it. Phil, it is largely crickets in the American media. I promise you, if Donald Trump had the same allegations, it would be wall to wall, as we have seen. Trump is problematic with women, no question. But let's hold the other side to the same exacting standards.
Well, I was going to ask you about Trump because, of course, he announced to the world some very questionable attitudes and seemed to confess to assaulting women. And it didn't seem to stop people voting for him. Is that because people have such low opinion of politicians in America anyway, they don't expect them to behave well anymore?
I think that's true. Number one, I talk about this in the very beginning of the book. I make clear to say this book is not partisan. And I talk about Donald Trump's grab him by the pee tape, and that horrifies, and it should. But I actually kind of think that we still don't regard crimes against women as all that unusual, or kind of, yeah, they're black marks, but is it that bad? I think anyone running for that office who wants that amount of power, you should be suspect of them, no matter your affiliation, because the amount of things they've had to do and the bodies left in their wake are probably legion to get to that point. So, again, I think a jaundiced eye is helpful, but I think the book exists, not as just reconsidered history and a necessary reconsidered history of the Kennedy family, but also of a reflection of where we are right now. And, women decide elections in America. So I think the more that women are sort of tuned into this stuff, the better off the body politic will be.
I wanted to ask you, were you aware of a book called The Five, written by a woman called Hallie Rubenfeld?
It sounds familiar. Tell me.
I think you would love it. It's not the same as your book by any means. It's about Jack the Ripper, but she was so fed up with seeing accounts that almost glamorize this terrible man that she wrote an entire book from the perspective of the five main victims of him.
Incredible.
To kind of validate them and to give them a voice, because they've never had a voice. They're just a kind of pile of body parts, really. And I did think about that often as I read your book, that you really gave these women agency and you gave them character. And the more you came to understand them, the more furious you became at the way they were treated. I mean, it does feel like you wrote it in a bit of a rage. Is that right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I was kind of, angry writing the book, and I had to sort of really then begin to pull back and, examine all of these women too as, architects in many ways of their own lives. And as I say in the book, none of these women are perfect. No victims are ever perfect, and that's okay. And it's a really mature way of looking at them. But I will say, I think that there is a kind of rage that is justified. There's been a kind of what we call in America a female rage that isn't really going away anytime soon. And it's originated in the Me Too movement, in the exposure of the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, of the Donald Trumps of the world, and now with reproductive rights sort of becoming another crucible that we're going through. It's not going away anytime soon, and it necessarily should not go away anytime soon. My favorite criticisms of the book, and I'm certainly not talking about your observation, which I think is justified, but it was from either male editors who were really on the bubble about buying it and then opted not to, or a particular male critic writing in the New York Times, which I'm going to frame and hang in the bathroom. How angry this book could be. Of course, this book should be angry. Look at what was done to these women and the way they've been historically ignored. What other response would you expect? Why
absolutely.
Are we still so uncomfortable with female rage? The one thing I want to add to that, Phil, in America, whenever we see an explosion of male rage, which most typically manifests in mass shootings, in school shootings, there is a rush in the media to say we need to understand the roots of this rage. We need to understand what activates these guys. That discussion is never instigated when it comes to female rage.
Well, look, thank you so much for your time. I think it's not only is it a great work of journalism, I think it's actually a beautifully written book. It's a piece of literature. I buy into it that you've lightly novelized, no doubt based on real evidence, these women's lives, and I think they deserve it. And I want to thank you for that and for your time.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. See you soon. Bye.
See you soon. Bye.
Powerful stuff indeed, and a really good book. I meant what I said. It's interesting as a work of literature as much as a work of journalism. The way that Maureen puts these women in the spotlight and sees the world through their eyes and gives them agency. They're not playthings. They are flesh and blood characters. And it's terrific. I really do recommend it. So come back to that story, I think. There's so much more to say. I probably could have talked to Maureen for another half hour at least. But yeah, her time was pressed, and I'm very grateful that she gave me 40 minutes. So I'm lucky I get to talk to people. Sam and Heifer, Maureen, and next week I'm sorry, I was going to do Clive Irving on Boeing. If you're listening, Clive, do apologise. I'm bumping you by a week because, as I mentioned at the beginning, David Hooper is a very important and well-connected British lawyer. Is going to come and talk about his experiences with the Fires in the 90s. And that case, which was, I thought it had been settled, as in they'd both agreed to sort of differ and go their own ways. But actually, I don't know what the precise legal term is, but basically Fire had backed off, and they all agreed. And this was after Dodie and Diana had died, that nobody wanted to go to court. There was sympathy for Fire. But basically, Vanity Fair, around my Condé Nast, I don't want to give it all away. They dug their heels in, and they had David and many other people producing a really strong defence for their journalism. And the article was never taken down. It's still available, apparently, on the Vanity Fair website right now. And it was the first warning. Maybe the shot across the bow stopped other journalists looking into it, or the sympathy that he had. But it's all in there. Not in as much detail as we now know. Nothing like as many people coming forward, but there's a lot in there. And it's an incredible story of how David tells me about how they tried to intimidate him, basically, and trap him. So I think you'll enjoy that. And that will be the next program. In the meantime, thank you once again. Really do appreciate the engagement. Had lots of lovely comments, lots of likes, and a little bit of an uptick in subscriptions as well, which is pleasing to see. Just 50 or so, but it's nice on YouTube. If you do like the show, please subscribe. And if you like the show and you think it deserves a bigger audience, just tell somebody about it. What's the worst they can do? Why did you recommend that boring podcast? It's awful. Let's hope they don't do that. No, do appreciate your support. Really do appreciate it. Thank you for watching. And I will see you next week with David. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.